I stared down at the jagged metal spikes glinting under the faint glow of my porch light, a swirl of dread and disbelief rolling through my stomach. The HOA, our ever-watchful homeowners association, had laid a trap right on the edge of my property, effectively blocking my one and only driveway. The sharpened teeth of these hidden strips were meant to shred tires, and if I hadn't spotted them in time, they could have shred my nerves. Little did they know that I wasn't about to roll over and give up. They'd pulled this stunt because of my so-called driveway farm, but they'd forgotten one crucial legal detail. To understand how I found myself face-to-face with a contraption more commonly used by police during high-speed chases, we have to rewind a bit. I moved to the Oak Hollow Estates, affectionately called the Hollows by reluctant residents, about 6 years ago. I was lured by the pristine streets, well-kept lawns, and the promise of a tight-knit community that the glossy brochures sold. In reality, it was more of a staged environment than a community. My neighbors were generally polite on the surface, nodding hellos and carefully collecting mail, but there was an ever-present tension in the air. The tension had everything to do with the HOA board, a small, power-hungry group led by a man named Malcolm Bryce. Think of a stereotypical wannabe politician. Broad gestures, dramatic voice, and an uncanny ability to show up at your doorstep the minute your grass was 2 inches too tall. That was Malcolm. Under his leadership, the HOA churned out monthly newsletters that dripped with regulations, fines, and warnings about keeping our community consistent. Residents put up with it because no one wanted a fight. No one thought an over-manicured sidewalk or a strict lawn color code was worth the energy, until me, I suppose. I never intended to challenge them. But 3 summers ago, I noticed how wasted my driveway area was. Some folks just parked old cars or let weeds grow in the cracks. I thought, what if I used that space more creatively? My father was a farmer in the Midwest, and I had his green thumb. The memory of him sowing seeds, checking the soil, and coaxing new life out of the ground was seared into my childhood. Watching him, I learned that gardens can exist anywhere if you're patient enough. So, I started small, a few raised garden beds, some tomato vines climbing a lattice, and a row of potted herbs. It wasn't exactly a pastoral paradise, but in a neighborhood that prized homogeneity above all else, my little driveway farm stuck out like a bright yellow dandelion on a putting green. And the neighbors? Well, some found it charming. I'd often find an appreciative note tucked into my mailbox or have someone wave me down to ask about my kale. But those were the quieter, friendlier folks. The HOA brass? Another story entirely. At first, I tried to follow their rules meticulously. I kept my plants in tidy planters, made sure none of the vines spilled out onto the sidewalk, and even ensured the colors of the planters were tasteful beige. But it didn't matter how neat I was. Within weeks, Malcolm and his cronies found reason after reason to hassle me. They cited obscure zoning guidelines, claimed my tomatoes were obstructing the neighborhood aesthetic, and slapped me with fines that smelled heavily of intimidation. I think what bothered them most was that it looked different, vibrant, colorful, and real in a place that prided itself on uniformity. Then came the Great Turnip Incident, as I like to call it. One day, I added turnips to the garden. Seemingly harmless, right? Well, the next morning, I woke to find an official HOA letter taped to my door, listing every violation under the sun. They threatened to have my property liened, or worse, bring me to court for failure to comply with guidelines. The battle lines had been drawn. I hired a local attorney, an old friend named Glenn who specialized in property disputes, and started filing countercomplaints. Glenn's eyebrows shot up to his hairline when I told him what the HOA had been doing. He suspected I might have more rights than they led me to believe, especially since the developer's original covenant allowed for limited agricultural pursuits if they were non-disruptive. The problem was no one had read that hidden covenant clause in ages, and the HOA's updated rulebook conveniently left it out. Yet, here I was a few months into a simmering legal scuffle, and now they'd resorted to literal sabotage. Someone from the HOA, probably under Malcolm's orders, had placed a strip of spikes just past my property line, but angled so that backing out of my driveway would certainly ruin my tires. It was cunningly placed, easy to miss unless you were specifically looking for it, or unless you felt the unfortunate crunch under your wheels. A sick feeling in my stomach told me this was no accident. It had to be documented. So I grabbed my phone and snapped a few pictures, making sure to capture the exact position of the spikes. I even took a short video for good measure. If the HOA thought they could intimidate me into submission, they had another thing coming. The real question was, how far were they willing to go to protect their precious uniform standards? And more importantly, what was the hidden legal detail that would tip the balance in my favor? I carefully removed the spike strip, well, a piece of it, anyway, using a pair of thick gloves and a sturdy metal pry bar. I wanted physical evidence, something I could show the authorities if I needed to. My mind was churning with ways to address this. Should I call the police? Confront Malcolm directly? Or just quietly gather documentation for the next HOA meeting? Of all the options, the police route felt overkill. They might brush it off as a neighborly dispute. Those spike strips certainly escalated things beyond the usual petty scuffles. Glenn had always counseled a measured approach, and I couldn't help hearing his voice in my head. Don't push unless you absolutely have to. Let them hang themselves with their own rope. Well, I had pictures, a chunk of that sabotage device, and a timeline of escalating harassment from the HOA. If they thought I'd stay silent, they were mistaken. I spent the next few days navigating strange looks from neighbors, especially those who served on the HOA board but didn't do the dirty work themselves. A couple of them had the decency to avert their eyes when they passed me. Perhaps word was already spreading that the attempted sabotage had been discovered, or maybe they just felt guilty. Even so, no one said a word to my face. As luck would have it, a mailbox flyer announced the next HOA meeting was a week away, giving me ample time to strategize. I've been all too eager to stand up for myself at these gatherings before, but the board members usually outvoted me. This time, I had something tangible to present, something the rest of the community could see. By gum, an actual spike strip was the definition of no longer playing nice. The night before the meeting, while I was stacking some freshly harvested veggies into baskets, part of my plan to win hearts and minds, frankly, I had a sudden realization. There was a detail in the original developer's agreement about self-sustaining property usage that was left intact for longtime residents. I recalled Glenn mentioning how the developer had a vision for a more eco-friendly neighborhood, encouraging small-scale agriculture. The HOA had revised so many rules over the years that no one seemed to remember that clause. If it was still technically in place, that changed everything. My farm wasn't just allowable, it was protected. At that very moment, my phone buzzed. It was Glenn texting me about how he'd cross-checked the county clerk's records with the neighborhood's original developer plan. From the tone of his message, it sounded like we had a genuine ace up our sleeve. This, I thought, was my chance to prove that not only had the HOA gone too far with their sabotage, but they were also blatantly ignoring the neighborhood's foundational guidelines. I felt a surge of mixed relief and excitement. My farm, my father's legacy in miniature, wasn't going anywhere. With the right presentation, I could not only stay, but potentially force the HOA to answer for their underhanded tactics. Finally, I found a crack in their fortress of red tape. But just as I thought about how to reveal this bombshell, another thought intruded. Maybe the timing of all this was more than luck. I found the spike strip just in time. I had the legal clause in my back pocket at just the right moment, and Glenn's confirmation arrived on the eve of the big meeting. Sometimes, timing changes everything. Just like subscribing to this channel seems to bring unexpected good fortune. Or so the rumor goes. It's like a little superstition we share. The minute you hit that subscribe button, small miracles start happening. But back to the story. I'll admit, I toyed with the idea of making a dramatic entrance at the meeting, rolling in the spike strip on a dolly, brandishing photos, giving a fiery speech about justice. But I knew that approach might turn neighbors off and cast me as a troublemaker. Instead, I decided on the calm, measured route. My plan was simple. Present evidence of the sabotage. Introduce the original development covenant that supported my driveway farm. Demand accountability from the board. The next day, as I loaded the car for the HOA meeting, I double-checked my supply of produce. Call me optimistic, but I had a notion that walking in with a crate of sweet-smelling tomatoes, crisp lettuce, and vibrant peppers might soften a few hearts. After all, who doesn't appreciate fresh vegetables, especially ones grown a few houses down from their own? When I arrived, the community center's parking lot was already crowded. A hush fell as I walked in, produce in one hand and a folded metal spike in the other. Malcolm was seated at the front, presiding over the elongated table like a king at his court. We locked eyes, and I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his usually smug gaze. The normal routine commenced. Finances, upcoming neighborhood events, landscaping budgets, mundane housekeeping. But the tension crackled as everyone in that room waited for the inevitable showdown. Finally, the secretary said, "Is there any new business?" I raised my hand. "Yes, I have something to share," I began, my voice steady. The entire board turned their eyes to me, and I felt the weight of their collective gaze. I set the crate of veggies on a nearby table, then carefully placed the piece of spike strip next to it. I noticed a few eyebrows shoot up. Malcolm cleared his throat, tried to maintain control of the meeting. "If it's about your continuing violation of our aesthetics rules," he began. I held up a hand. "This isn't about me breaking any rules," I said, my tone calm but pointed. "It's about the fact that someone used a device to potentially harm me and my property. Here's proof." Silence fell across the room. Now was the moment of truth. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead filled the silence as I let my words sink in. A few neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Malcolm's composure cracked for just an instant before he forced a practiced smile. "Why don't we hear all the facts before making assumptions?" he said, his tone aiming for neutrality but landing somewhere between patronizing and nervous. I carefully set the spike strip piece on the front table. "I found this partially buried at the edge of my driveway," I said. "It's designed to puncture tires. A single mistake pulling out of my home could have wrecked my vehicle, or worse." I caught the eyes of a neighbor named Lisa, who'd been sympathetic to my plight from the start. She looked horrified. "Are you suggesting the HOA planted that device?" Malcolm asked, arching an eyebrow like he was performing for a courtroom drama. "I'm suggesting someone who opposes my driveway farm tried to sabotage me," I replied. "And given the ongoing letters, fines, and warnings, it's a fair assumption that person or persons is associated with the HOA. Because who else is so upset with my tomatoes?" A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. I sensed many folks thought I was crazy, but others took note of my calm, deliberate posture and the photographic evidence I'd pinned up on a display board. Yes, I printed out color photos of the spike strip in its original location. Malcolm crossed his arms. "We can't possibly condone that kind of action," he said, feigning outrage. "It's highly illegal, and the HOA is not in the business of harming residents." Before anyone could interrupt, I stepped closer to the table. "I believe you when you say it's illegal. That's why I'm reporting it to the local authorities. But there's more to discuss here than just who planted the strip." I paused for emphasis. "For instance, my driveway farm. According to the original developer's covenant, limited agricultural pursuits on personal property are permitted so long as they don't impede public access or cause nuisance. I have documentation right here." I lifted a folder from my stack of papers. A stir went through the audience. Papers rustled. Heads turned. Malcolm tried to maintain his carefully constructed poker face, but a flash of irritation crossed his features. That document was superseded by more recent HOA guidelines. "Actually," I cut in, raising my voice slightly, "it can't be superseded. Not without unanimous approval of every homeowner in the subdivision, including me. The original covenant is filed with the county, and it specifically states the provision remains in effect unless voted out by all residents. Has there been such a vote?" He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Other board members whispered among themselves, flipping through their rulebooks or scanning their phones. I almost felt sorry for them, but the months of harassment had worn my patience thin. Taking advantage of the shock in the room, I pressed on. "This means my little driveway farm is perfectly legal. And it also means the fines, the threats, the intimidation tactics." I laid a stern gaze on Malcolm. "All of it is based on rules that don't hold up under the covenant. I have no idea who placed the spike strip, but at the very least, this board allowed a toxic atmosphere where such an attack feels permissible. That, ladies and gentlemen, is unacceptable. An older gentleman named Robert, who rarely spoke at these meetings, cleared his throat. "Young man," he began, tilting his head toward me, "my kids love your tomatoes. If it's in the covenant that you're allowed to do this, I don't see a problem. We used to have a neighbor who grew corn in his backyard, and it never bothered us." A few others voiced agreement. Malcolm's forced smile returned. "Well, if the covenant does indeed protect your garden, then the HOA board will, of course, respect that. But we should still ensure." "Ensure what?" I cut him off, though I try not to sound rude. "Ensure it blends in with the rest of the neighborhood? Or will you simply continue to harass me with petty citations? Because if that's the case, I've already engaged my attorney and local law enforcement. I won't hesitate to take this further." He said nothing, but his knuckles were white against the table's edge. At that moment, a thought flickered through my mind like a lightning flash. I'd won. Now, winning a standoff with an HOA might not sound like leading troops through a grand battle, but given how many folks in the Hollows lived in quiet fear of fines and petty rules, it sure felt like a victory. However, I also realized I had to be cautious. Victory wasn't guaranteed if the board found some underhanded method to spin the situation. "Let's open the floor to discussion," said the secretary, glancing nervously between Malcolm and me. She seemed relieved to pass the heat onto the broader group. One by one, neighbors voiced their thoughts, some in support of the farm, some in half-hearted protest about property values, and a few who just didn't care as long as it didn't affect them. In the midst of this public debate, I noticed Lisa stand up. She smoothed the front of her blouse and spoke softly but firmly. "I've lived here for 20 years, and my husband and I always loved the idea of a more sustainable community. We kept quiet because we assumed we had no choice. But if our original developer made this promise, I think we should honor it. Better fresh produce than another bland walkway." A few more residents nodded in agreement. I felt gratitude well up within me, followed by a steadiness in my own resolve. The tide was turning in my favor, but I could almost see Malcolm's mind spinning, searching for a new angle. Eventually, the board realized they were cornered. The evidence was too strong, and the neighbors' curiosity and support were growing. If they didn't capitulate, a bigger legal storm would land at their doorstep, and it wouldn't be me paying the defense attorney's fees. Malcolm begrudgingly announced they'd review the covenant in detail and suspend any enforcement actions related to the farm. That was as close to a surrender as I was going to get tonight. Satisfaction warmed my chest, but I also knew this victory was only half the battle. The spike strip sabotage was still hanging in the air like a foul odor. Who did it? And would they try again? Even with the legal coverage, if someone was this desperate, they might escalate further. But for now, it felt like progress. After the meeting wrapped, a few neighbors approached me, asked for tips on starting their own small plots. I offered them fresh produce from my crate, smiling as they left. Lisa gave my arm a gentle squeeze, a quiet show of support. I caught sight of Malcolm slipping out the back door, face stormy, posture stiff. We were far from any real reconciliation, but at least, for the moment, the noose of petty fines and intimidation had loosened. I walked outside into the cool evening air. Even though it was nearly 9 p.m., the sky still glowed with the last purple remnants of twilight. I took a slow, satisfied breath. There was work yet to be done, but for the first time in months, I felt a real sense of relief. With the covenant on my side, the HOA had lost its biggest weapon, the fear factor. Still, one question kept tugging at me. Who on earth thought laying down spike strips was a justified move? I fully intended to pursue legal action for that, no matter how the board tried to gloss over it. Because someone had gone way beyond the pale here, and if they were willing to do that once, I wasn't convinced they wouldn't try something worse next time. True to his word, Glenn helped me file a formal police report about the sabotage. I handed over the photos and the piece of the strip I'd pried out of my driveway. The responding officer, a slightly graying fellow named Sergeant Perry, raised both eyebrows at my evidence. "Never thought I'd see this kind of thing in a quiet place like Oak Hollow Estates," he said, taking notes. We'll investigate, though I can't promise immediate results. It's tricky, especially if no one saw who did it. I understood. Deep down, I suspected Malcolm or a henchman, but I had no hard proof beyond circumstantial motives. It was possible some overzealous neighbor, not necessarily on the board, took it upon themselves to deal with the farm. Either way, I planned to keep my cameras rolling. After the officer left, I installed a couple of motion sensor cameras around my property for extra peace of mind. If anyone tried something again, I'd had a record of it. Meanwhile, word spread around the neighborhood about my legal triumph. The covenant had always been there, hidden in plain sight, but no one paid attention because the HOA's updated rulebook overshadowed it. Now that the truth was out, a wave of curiosity seemed to ripple through the community. I noticed a few neighbors planting more flowers and even trying potted herbs on their patios. Lisa put up a small trellis for cucumbers in her backyard. A once tightly wound area was starting to unwind at least a bit. The next HOA newsletter arrived with a curiously softened tone. Gone was the usual condescending language about strict compliance. Instead, it talked about honoring our neighborhood's original vision, referencing sustainable gardening and community-driven beauty. I nearly choked on my morning coffee when I saw they'd even included a friendly note encouraging the cultivation of small vegetable plots. Did I imagine it? Or were they taking credit for an idea I'd fought tooth and nail to preserve? Regardless, it felt like a partial victory. However, I knew better than to let my guard down. Malcolm's signature was noticeably absent from the letter, replaced by that of the secretary and a couple of other board members. Maybe Malcolm was lying low, or maybe he was working on a new scheme. My father used to say, the best fertilizer for a garden is the owner's shadow. By that he meant you have to keep a close eye on what you plant and on the people who might trample it. As the weeks passed, my driveway farm flourished. Corn stalks shot up tall in neat rows, tomatoes ripened to a juicy red, and I even added a small beehive in the backyard, while within city regulations. On any given afternoon, a handful of neighbors would walk by, some stopping to admire the progress or chat about the best way to keep pests away. I felt the once stifling atmosphere of Oak Hollow Estates lighten. Every so often, I'd catch glimpses of Malcolm driving by in a sedan, eyes straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge me. But his silence was telling. The board hadn't sent me a single citation since the big showdown. Then, in a surprising twist, a rumor started circulating about a new homeowner's vote. The board wanted to ratify an official policy acknowledging small-scale agriculture. It included guidelines about heights of plants, the type of fencing allowed, and some other minor details. While part of me bristled at the idea of even more rules, the draft policy was actually quite fair. In many ways, it recognized the old covenant's spirit, albeit with a few modern refinements. And I had to admit, if it was done right, it might prevent future conflicts. Folks who wanted to plant a little produce now wouldn't have to fight the system. The system would actually support them. I found myself drawn into more dialogue with the moderate board members, those who'd always been overshadowed by Malcolm. We exchanged ideas about community gardens, shared tool libraries, and maybe even a Harvest Day festival if enough people participated. The irony wasn't lost on me. The HOA, once my biggest antagonist, could become a partner in building something better for the neighborhood. Meanwhile, Sergeant Perry dropped by occasionally, letting me know they'd found no conclusive proof of who planted the spike strips. I was disappointed, but not surprised. Without surveillance footage or a credible witness, it was my word against the HOA's general hostility. I told him I'd keep my cameras rolling, and he said he'd keep the case open. The best I could do was remain vigilant. One evening, just as the setting sun cast long shadows across my newly expanded garden rows, I felt a presence behind me. Turning, I saw Malcolm at the edge of my driveway, his posture awkward, maybe even contrite. We stood there for a moment, silent. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Nice garden," he said, voice stiff. "I see why people like it." I nodded, unsure of his angle. "Thanks." He looked at the ground. "The board's new policy, it's not official yet, but it's happening. I just wanted you to know The way things went down, that's not how I wanted it. He swallowed hard. You know me. I worry about property values, uniformity, that sort of thing. I almost laughed. That's the gist of an HOA, I guess. He gave a short nod. But I never authorized anything dangerous like that device. I hope you believe me. I weighed his words. His contrition felt sincere, but that didn't mean he was innocent. He could be lying. Still, maybe the ordeal had taught him something about the limits of control. I believe someone from the HOA might have acted on their own, I said carefully. I like to believe it wasn't you, but it's hard to erase everything that happened. He grimaced. Right. Look, I can't change the past, but I can help move forward. Let's just say the new guidelines will be quite clear about what's allowed. And your produce is good for the community. Our next potluck, people are talking about using your vegetables. I studied him, searching for any hint of deception. But he seemed genuine enough, a man trying to salvage some semblance of dignity. Finally, I nodded. All right. Thanks, Malcolm. He hovered for another moment, then turned to leave. I watched him go, feeling a strange mix of relief and lingering suspicion. Trust wouldn't come overnight, but if the community was truly shifting towards a more open-minded approach, maybe that was victory enough. As dusk settled, I walked along the rows of my driveway farm, gently touching the leaves of each plant. My father's words echoed in my mind. Each garden is a promise. You plant seeds in the expectation they'll grow. I realized the same principle applied to neighborhoods, and even the prickliest HOAs. If you plant enough seeds of goodwill and stand up against the bullies, something better can sprout. Yes, the spike strips had been a chilling escalation, and we never did discover the culprit. Yet in trying to trap me, they exposed a hidden legal detail that shifted the entire power dynamic. They tried to bury me, but they forgot I was a seed. And seeds, when nurtured, eventually break through to the light, changing the landscape for everyone, whether a homeowners association likes it or not. That night, I harvested a basket of tomatoes, cucumbers, and peppers under the soft glow of the porch light. As I headed inside, I couldn't help but smile at the irony. My driveway farm had become more than just a hobby. It was now a symbol of how small freedoms can thrive even in the most rigid environments. And that felt like a harvest worth celebrating, not just for me, but for any neighbor who'd ever dreamed of something a little greener, a little freer, and far less ordinary. The end.